All right, everybody, welcome to the Chad Blackman podcast. I am your host. You guessed it. I am Chad Blackman. This is a very exciting episode. I have been thinking a lot about this topic and excited to kind of dig into this a little bit today because it's been actually cool for me to research this and study this a little bit, and I hope that this helps you. I hope that you kind of get some clarity and maybe a little more confidence when it comes to this particular issue we're going to cover today. On the table, what we've got on the docket today is the topic of marriage and sexuality. This right now, I'm recording this podcast in November of 2023. In the last 10 years or so, I have watched this topic split churches right down the middle. I have watched this topic turn into a hotbed political issue that both sides, conservatives and liberals, are both fighting tooth and nail over. I have watched marriage equality, marriage rights, definitions of marriage be debated about, be argued about. This is a very, very kind of live wire issue right now in our current day and age. And what I wanted to try to do with this podcast today is try to give as clearly as I can and maybe deeper than what's normally given the biblical picture of marriage and explain not so much what marriage is. I think that is important and we will talk about that. But it seems to me where the real rub is coming in is explaining why has God created marriage? Why is marriage even a thing? What's the whole purpose behind it? And so today I want to try to clearly spell this out, clearly articulate what exactly is marriage and why has this thing called marriage been designed? What's some of the deeper purposes? Because what I have found is that if we can understand not just what the Bible has to say about marriage, if we can understand the why behind it as well, what it's helped me do is not buy into all the propaganda and the vitriol and like the arguments that are coming from both sides, from conservatives and liberals. It kind of removes a lot of the fog that comes from political rhetoric and arguing and like talking points. It sort of clears that out and helps you see this is biblically what God has intended for marriage. And when you see biblically what he's trying to do with marriage, it then helps clarify everything else. So without further ado, let me try to get into this here, and hopefully with this huge, massive topic, hopefully I can bring a little bit of clarity to it. So let's first ask the question, what is marriage and why? What is marriage and why? Marriage in the Bible is the very first institution that is given in all of the scriptures. It's given before the law. It's given before any of the prophets. It's given before any kind of prophecy about Messiah, about Jesus. In Genesis chapter 2, God tells Adam, he says to him, for this reason, a man shall leave his mother and father and be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. God gives this very specific direction and institution to Adam. Leave your mother and father, be united to your wife. This is the pattern. This is what is good for man to do. And then he says, be fruitful, be fruitful and multiply, rather. So he gives these to Adam and Eve this institution, this call. And then he'll later tell them, go out into all the world and subdue it, bring order to it. Theologians call this the creation mandate, to go out and bring order to the world around us. So marriage then, specifically in a definitional sense, is one man, one woman in the covenant of marriage, promising to be faithful to one another. That's kind of what this is. You leave your mother and father and you cling to your wife, and you and your wife become this new family unit. That's what God is telling Adam in Genesis 2. Now, I think that's fairly approachable. I know there's debate about, is it one man, one woman? Could it be two men? Could it be two women? Could it be 5 men, 5 women? There's debate on that, but just very strictly speaking, in the scriptures, one man, one woman. That's what the Bible is describing. Now, here's the more important question. Why? Why has God given this institution to man, and why do we see marriage referred to all throughout the scriptures, Old Testament into the New? There are constant allusions to marriage all throughout the Bible. Here is the best answer I can give you. And I'm pulling a lot of this content today from lectures I have heard by Dr. Linda Seiler. I would highly recommend her resources to you. She has some amazing lectures and sermons on YouTube. She is a very helpful resource in this particular area. Why marriage? Here's why. God has created marriage and sexuality to reflect what He's like. So I want to make sure you hear that clearly. God has created marriage to reflect what He's like. He builds marriage and human sexuality. It's all His idea. This is really important because it means man did not come up with marriage. If man came up with marriage, then of course we could define the terms of marriage to be anything that we wanted. Then of course, if we came up with it, it's arbitrary. One culture may say marriage is one man, one woman. Another culture, another community might say it's 2 men and 1 woman, or 3 women and 1 man. It's all subjective and arbitrary if mankind came up with this. The scriptures, though, are going to say, no, this is God's idea. God took this thing called marriage and sexuality, clearly spells it out to Adam, and gives it to him from His own mind. And He gives it to Adam and Eve and then to the rest of humanity for a couple of specific reasons. He's trying to mirror what He's like in this kind of smaller little microcosm called marriage. And this is something God does all throughout the Bible. You see Him represent Himself in all kinds of like smaller, more approachable human ways. He has put all of these like little clues and hints and like little mini pictures of Himself throughout the Old Testament and even into the New. For example, like the whole sacrificial system, that there would be spotless lambs, no defect, no fault in them, and they would be killed to atone for sin. That, of course, is immensely picturesque of Christ and what He would do. Even in Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve sin, what God does is He kills an animal and then takes the skin from that animal and properly clothes Adam and Eve. See, that's like this little mini picture of what Christ would do. He would die, and then He would clothe us properly in His righteousness. All throughout the Old Testament, you see these little representations, these little mini pictures of Himself. And that's what He's trying to do with marriage. Marriage is this living, breathing, little mini picture of what He's like. And the idea is that as people looked at marriage, they would be able to see there's deeper realities here. There's deeper spiritual implications at play. Marriage is way deeper than just 2 people deciding to live together. It's way deeper than just like this arbitrary societal contract where it's like, hey, I'll just live with you, as long as everything's cool, and we'll have a ceremony and have a feast and whatever, and go on a cool honeymoon. It's so much deeper than that. The Bible is trying to communicate to you and I, no, your marriage actually is reflecting some eternal qualities about God. It's just doing it in like a smaller little human way. It's like a tiny little microcosm of a greater reality. So let's talk about then some of these greater realities. Well, first and foremost, one of the things that we see about God in the Bible is that He is a creator. In fact, this is the first description of God that we really get in Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So, God is able to speak time, matter, space, energy. He speaks everything into existence just by his mere words. Theologians call this creation ex nihilo. Out of nothing, he can create. What God then does to sort of mirror and kind of replicate and copy in a smaller way that creative aspect of who God is, he creates this thing called marriage and sexuality. God tells Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply. Humans cannot create in the same way God can, but what we can do is procreate. When a husband and wife are joined together in the sexual act, in sexual intercourse, that obviously is what then leads to new human life. Sexuality then isn't just like the practical side of you got to replicate and make babies. It's in that act we are mirroring and we are copying and we are reflecting God's creative nature. He intends for procreation to be a picture of a greater reality, that God is the creator. There is another reality here at play. Marriage and sexuality is intended by God to reflect the fact that God, in and of himself, has covenantal relationship. So let me explain what I mean by that. When I use the word covenantal or covenant, what I just mean is I mean a promise, and I mean like a very serious promise. A covenant is like the highest level of a promise you can give, the highest level of faithfulness and trustworthiness that you can give. And so what we see in the scriptures is that God, in and of himself, just within the Trinity, that there is perfect covenantal faithfulness and relationship. In the very first chapter of the Bible, Genesis 1, there is this veiled allusion to the Trinity. In verse 28, if I'm not mistaken, God literally is communicating amongst himself. The text reads, God said, let us make man in our image. So you have to ask the question, who's God talking about right there? He's speaking in a plural. Let us make man in our image. Christian theology, Orthodox theology, is going to teach that God is three in one, that he is one divine essence in three distinct persons. We're going to cover this a little bit more in just a moment. But what we have in the Trinity is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit in perfect community and perfect love with one another. The reason why this is important is when the Bible says that God is love, the Trinity helps explain how that can exist. There is no way for there to be love if God is just singular in his personhood. The fact that there is three distinct persons, one common essence amongst them, you have perfect community, perfect love, perfect relationship. Where marriage and sexuality then comes into play is Genesis chapter 2. God looks down at Adam. He looks at Adam, who is made in his image, and says, it's not good for Adam to be alone. Why? Because he's an image bearer, and he's in the image of this God who exists in perfect covenantal relationship. The Trinity has relationship, but yet here's Adam all by himself. So he then creates Eve. He creates Eve, who is also an image bearer. He creates Eve, who is an ezer, the Hebrew says, a helper. One who is bone of his bones and flesh of his flesh. When Adam beholds Eve, he goes, finally, this is one that's just like me. So God then creates marriage to be this little mini picture of the perfect covenantal faithfulness and love and unity that's within the Godhead. It's almost like he's saying, when a husband and a wife love each other well, that's picturesque of how the Trinity is perfectly in union and communion and fellowship with one another. But then the New Testament goes even further with this covenantal relationship. Because in Ephesians chapter 5, Paul, he says, hey, marriage isn't just picturesque of the Trinity, it's picturesque of something else. It reflects the way Christ loves the church. This means that the way a husband loves his wife is actually mirroring a far greater, far more profound reality. You are kind of replicating in a small way how Christ loves his bride, the church. Jesus over and over and over refers to the church as his bride, that he is the groom and we as believers are his bride. So Paul's going, hey, when you husbands, when you love your wives well, you care for her well, you provide for her well, you protect, you nurture, you lead, you do all of these things, you're actually mirroring something greater than yourself. You're kind of following in the footsteps of Christ. You are this little mini picture of what he's like. Same thing with the wife. When the wife loves her husband well and is faithful to her husband and serves the husband and encourages the husband, comes alongside the husband, this is picturesque of the church then walking with Christ, following Christ, submitting to the leadership and the headship of Christ. There's deep, deep spiritual realities that are at play there. So we have then God's creative nature being replicated in our procreation. We have this covenantal relationship of the Trinity being mirrored in the way we love each other well, and then the way Christ loves the church, that's then mirrored in how a husband and a wife love each other. And then finally, and this is probably the most important one, what God's trying to picture in marriage is the fact that he is 3 in 1. This is one of the most mind-boggling doctrines about the God of the Bible, that he is 3 in 1. Philosophers and theologians refer to this as there being unity in diversity. There's unity in diversity, meaning there's unity that God is of one essence. He is God. But in that unity, there is diversity. There are 3 distinct persons, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, all co-equally, co-powerfully, co-eternally God, but we interact with them differently. I am not saved by the blood of the Spirit. I'm saved by the blood of the Son. But then in the same way, I am now indwelt by the Spirit. I am not indwelt by the Father. I am not indwelt by the Son. It's the Spirit that now lives in me. So there's distinction, yet equality amongst them. And this unity in diversity becomes immensely important. And I know this might be a little bit lofty. I know this is like a little bit academic, but just try and track with me here because you'll see how this becomes really important. God says to Adam and Eve, for this reason, a man shall leave his mother and father, and the two shall become what? They shall become one flesh. So that, of course, is referring to not just the act of sexual intimacy, but it's referring to the fact that now these 2 distinct humans, they now become one unique family unit. That they are now joined together through the physical act of sex, but then also their lives are joined together. Their hearts kind of mingle together. Their souls and their minds are united and kind of stitched together in this really profound, deep way. And it's crazy because there's still distinction. There's still the husband and the wife, but yet they're this cohesive, singular unit. And he's trying to show then that's what the Trinity's like. The same way a husband and wife, the 2 become one, this is picturesque of the Trinity, that the Trinity is 3 in 1. And it's in this unity and diversity that we start to see some of the reasons why God has put certain parameters around sexuality. We start to see why he's kind of laid out, this is what sex is for. For example, God clearly explains that human sexuality is to be expressed between one man, one woman in the covenant of marriage. Now, is that because God's a prude and because he's trying to keep us from having sexual freedom and sexual liberation? Is that because God's kind of this old, crusty, boring man? No. The reason why he puts those parameters around it is because he's trying to reflect his nature. So to be a little clearer then, to get a little more specific, the reason why the Bible will say homosexual sex cannot be ordained and blessed by God is because there's too much unity in that. You have two men or two women. Well, sex is designed to mirror God. We're trying to mirror that unity in diversity. When there's two men together, there's too much unity, not enough diversity. Same thing with two females. Or if we start then becoming polyamorous, polygamous, having multiple partners, the same problem arises. We start to have too much unity and not enough diversity, or too much diversity and not enough unity. It's why bestiality is prohibited in the scriptures, because there is not enough, there's too much diversity. That's what I'm trying to say. Too much diversity and not enough unity. And in both of those cases, whether it be homosexual sex or some kind of bestiality actions, or even, we'll say, pornography and masturbation. Heterosexual pornography, masturbation, that in and of itself, there's too much unity right there. It's just one person. They're not reflecting the diversity that God intended. And in all of those cases, there is no potential for procreation. Because remember, in marriage and sexuality, we're trying to replicate and mirror what God is like. Well, he is a creator, and we replicate that by being procreative. In bestiality, in homosexuality, in masturbation, in those kinds of things, there's either too much unity, too much diversity, and all cases have no potential for procreation. Now, people will sometimes push back on this and say, okay, well, what about a husband and wife who can't conceive? There's infertility. And that's a great question, very fair question. One of the things that I would point to is that a husband and wife who cannot conceive will go to the doctor and try to get help. They may try to adjust some hormones or try some different techniques. That they will try to get help because the potential for conception is there. The potential for procreation is there. And if they are unable, what we say is that, well, there's something that has stopped this, something that is blocking it. There's something that's kind of been broken then in their capacity, because they have the potential to do this. On the flip side, what you're never going to see two gay men go to a fertility clinic and say, why can't we have babies? Because there is absolutely no potential there for that to happen. And then all the other prohibitions that are centered around sexuality, like this is why pedophilia is strictly prohibited. Pedophilia is prohibited because there is no procreative potential there. Parents are specifically called in the Bible to love and protect their children in the same way that our Heavenly Father loves and protects us. And to then violate their sexuality is of course, a direct affront to that. This is why we see in the scriptures, like having multiple partners, having multiple spouses. We are prohibited from that, not because God is overly restrictive, but because he's saying Christ claims to only have one bride, and that's the church. Your marriage and sexuality is meant to reflect him. So how could a husband take on multiple wives? This isn't what Christ has said. He says, I have one bride, the church, and we're called to then reflect that. This is why the Bible has such hard lines drawn in the sand when it comes to divorce. because to say that these two, a husband and wife who God has joined together, to say that they could fracture and break apart is almost like saying that the Trinity could break apart, or that God's love through Christ for the church could somehow be fractured and somehow break apart. And those are realities that just can't happen. God has promised his faithfulness through Christ to the church. We see the faithfulness of the Trinity within themselves all through the scriptures, perfect submission from one another in the Godhead. So this is why the Bible's like, hey, divorce is so serious. Divorce is such an intense, like soul-shattering experience. It is something to be avoided at all costs. It is like absolutely the last resort, because you're picturing something so much more beautiful. So I hope that this kind of makes sense, and I hope that this starts to frame up not just what marriage is, but why marriage is the way it is. And what it's helped me to see is that a lot of the stuff that's coming from like the conservative right, a lot of that is rooted in like some self-righteous, judgmental, kind of high horse politicizing. Like, we have the moral high ground, you are the heathens out there screwing up America. I see a lot of that kind of rhetoric. But then on the left and on the more liberal side is that they're creating the same mistake just on a different level. It's like, you're the homophobic, bigoted, closed-minded, repressive people that's restricting our freedom. And what I'm trying to say is that both of those sides have missed what this is all about. Marriage is really about God. It's about reflecting who God is. And until we see that, until we buy into that, what we're going to find is that we're chasing this illusion about marriage. We'll be chasing this like fairy tale version of marriage that if I could just find the love of my life, then all my problems would disappear. And marriage was never designed to do that. Marriage is absolutely helpful and brings companionship, and it is a good thing. He who finds a wife finds a good thing, like finds favor and blessing from the Lord. But I think sometimes we have romanticized and idealized marriage to be like this, almost this functional savior. Like, this will make us happy. This will fix us and solve all of our internal deficiencies. And the Bible's like, hey, it's not actually really about you. Marriage is not really about you. It's about reflecting the glory and the wonder of God. And the more you line yourself up with that, the more that you go, hey, this is about God, you actually then find more fulfillment, more peace, more motivation to love your spouse well. Your marriage works way better when you start to see that it's actually not really about you. It's about honoring God. And it makes sense to me now why the enemy has gone after marriage in such an aggressive fashion. And it's not just with the LGBT stuff. Heterosexuals have done just as good of a job as the other side of the coin, tainting and staining marriage. I mean, all you gotta do is turn on like broadcast television and see all the ridiculous shows that are on there about marriage. I mean, shows about, 90 Day Fiancé, The Bachelor, The Bachelorette. Like, there's all of these dating and marriage shows where people are like looking for true love, and it's just a mockery of marriage. It's just drama, sexual immorality, hedonism. So I'm not trying to point the finger squarely at one group. Like, it's not just the LGBTQ community that's caused damage here. Heterosexuals have as well. What I'm trying to say to both parties is, this is what God has designed marriage for. It's not so much about you. It's actually about reflecting Him. And the sooner we get our minds wrapped around that, the sooner that we start to fall in step with that, the sooner that our marriages will be more healthy, will be healed, the more we'll start to walk in joy, and the more we'll start to be able to see the lies and the deceptions of the enemy. So that's about all I got for you. Whew, man, if you made it through this one, props. You got chops, man. That's a heavy, hard podcast to hear and work through and hear all that. Hopefully it made sense. Hopefully you have not fallen asleep by now. And I want to thank you for listening. Seriously, I really appreciate you. Thank you for checking this out. God bless you, and I'll see you on the next podcast. All right, bye.